Welcome to today's lesson on subtracting mixed numbers. Today, we're going to learn a few strategies that you can use while you're subtracting mixed numbers. Let's go ahead and get started. We're going to start with 1 3/4, which we have pictured here in blue. Then we're going to subtract 2/3. Now, it's important to remember that I have written our fractions separately from our whole numbers because we're subtracting mixed numbers today. And a mixed number writes the fraction separate from the whole. So our first step is to look at our denominators in our fractions and see if they're the same. And if they're not, we need to come up with a common denominator. Since we're subtracting thirds from fourths, we need to find a common denominator. So I'm going to multiply my numerator and my denominator by 3. And that's going to give me an equivalent fraction in twelfths. 3 times 3 equals 9, and 4 times 3 equals 12. So I just barely changed my fraction into twelfths. Now it's important to remember that I didn't change the amount that we had shaded in, I only changed the number of pieces that we have in the whole. So now I need to do the same for the number that I'm subtracting. I need to change my thirds into twelfths as well. To do that, I'm going to multiply my numerator and my denominator by 4. 2 times 4 equals 8, and 3 times 4 equals 12. So now I know that I need to subtract 8 twelfths from 9 twelfths. In order to do this, I'm going to cross off 8 twelfths of my diagram. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So I have now subtracted 8 twelfths, and that leaves me with 1/12 left over. And if we subtract our fractions, 9 twelfths minus 8 twelfths equals that 1/12 that we have left over. And since we didn't have to divide our whole number into a fraction as well, we're just going to bring our whole number down, which makes sense because 1 minus 0 equals 1. So 1 3/4 minus 2/3 equals 1 1/12. Let's go ahead and walk through a word problem together. Lou is baking for a bake sale. Her cookie recipe requires 1 1/3 cup of flour. Her brownie recipe requires 1 3/4 cup of flour. If Lou has 3 1/4 cup of flour, will she have enough flour to make her brownies after she makes cookies? Well, let's go ahead and check out our information. We know that we're starting with 3 1/4 cup of flour. So I have that shown below. We have 3 wholes and 1/4. We know we're going to start by subtracting 1 1/3 because she's making cookies first. And then we can see if she has at least 1 3/4 cup left over for the brownies. So let's go ahead and put this into an equation. We have 3 wholes and 1/4 of flour that she's starting with, and we're going to subtract 1 whole and 1/3 that she's going to use for the cookies. Now our first step is to look at our denominator. Now as you can see, we have fourths and thirds, which means that we need to come up with a common denominator. So I need to change my fourths and my thirds into twelfths. Now I'm going to do this by multiplying my numerator and denominator by the same number. So I just changed 1/4 into 3/12. I want to make sure that my diagram matches, so I have my 1/4, and I'm just going to break it into twelfths, so I now have 3/12 represented. So now I need to multiply the numerator and denominator of my thirds so that I can also change this into twelfths. That's going to give me 4/12. So now I'm all set to start subtracting. But wait a second. I can't subtract 4/12 from 3/12. I only have 3/12 lined up. That means that I need to regroup one of my wholes. So I'm going to take this whole and I'm going to break it apart into twelfths. So I only have 2 wholes left, and now I have 12 twelfths, which I'm going to add to my 3/12 I already have. That means I now have 15 twelfths. Now I can subtract 4/12 from 15/12. So I'm going to subtract 1, 2, 3, 4. And that leaves me with 11/12 left over. So now I can subtract my whole numbers. I have 2 wholes, and I need to subtract 1. So I'm going to subtract 1 whole, and that leaves me with 1 whole left over. So now, if Lou starts with 3 1/4 cup of flour and uses 1 1/3 cup of flour for her cookies, she will have 1 11/12 cups of flour left over. So is that enough to make brownies? Well, let's see. We know that brownies require 1 3/4 cup of flour. And if we find a common denominator for fourths, we have 1 9/12 cup of flour needed for brownies, which is less than the 1 11/12 that we have left over. So that means she'll have plenty of flour to make brownies. Let's take a moment to review what you've learned in today's lesson. When you're subtracting mixed numbers, your first step is to make sure that your denominators are the same. If they're not the same, then you need to find a common denominator for both before continuing further. Then, you need to see if your top fraction is larger than your bottom fraction. If it's not, you're going to need to regroup one of your wholes into fraction amounts. 1/6 plus 6/6, which is our whole we took from over here, equals 7/6. And that's going to make your top fraction larger than your bottom fraction. So now I can subtract 7/6 minus 5/6, which gives me 2/6. And lastly, then you can subtract your whole numbers. 4 minus 4 equals 0. Now you always want to check your work and make sure that you can't simplify your problem any further. And if you can, then make sure you go ahead and simplify it by dividing your numerator and denominator by the same number.